Good morning, everyone. We are continuing with our discussion of karma, reincarnation, and the chakras. Let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. Help us to feel the truth of the divine laws that govern our lives. Help us to understand that in harmony with these laws lies our greatest happiness. Awaken us that we may see ourselves as we truly are, and we may live as we are destined to live in harmony with your grace. Om. Peace. Amen. So when I ended the last session, I was quoting St. Augustine about we were made for thee alone, and our hearts are restless until we find our rest in thee. So this is the basic concept that we're working with when we start talking about karma and reincarnation, and later on in this session I'll get into how the chakras work with this. So the premise of everything that we're talking about is that we are made from Sat-Chit-Ananda, and our destiny is to live always in bliss. It's perfectly obvious from looking at our own life and looking at the lives of people around us that most people do not live in bliss. Many people live in varying degrees of suffering, and some of that suffering is really intense. The law of karma is not popular because it explains that everything that happens is happening for a reason, and that what we're looking at is not injustice but justice. That is a big challenge that we need to sort of put on the shelf until we can work with this long enough to sort of see how that is all going to weave together. So the reason why we're born is to gradually be able to see through the veil of delusion that makes us think that the outer world is the real world, and that makes us essentially indifferent or unaware even of the vibrations of inner consciousness, which is the true and lasting reality of this. The project of life comes down essentially to this, which is as I was saying yesterday, what causes suffering, what brings happiness. Related to that is what is real, lastingly real, and what only appears, gives the impression of reality, but in fact is just an illusion. Our whole journey, all of our incarnations, and the process of each individual incarnation is to move up the spectrum away from delusion and closer to enlightenment. And the reason we want to do that is that the more enmeshed we are in delusion, the more vulnerable we are to suffering. The closer we are to enlightenment, the more our lives become one of freedom and happiness. And because those are the two motivating factors always in everything we do, there comes a point where we've had enough repetitive experience that we simply begin to ask deeper and deeper questions. So eventually, and this is the eventually of God realization, eventually we come to understand that everything is a manifestation of Sat-Chit-Ananda, and any suffering that we experience is merely because we are resisting that manifestation instead of cooperating with it. That's not very clear, so let me find it another way. Let me think of another way to say this. Okay, just give me a moment here. I want to think about different ways that I might put this across. I think I'm going to digress for a moment, and I'm going to give you a 4 stages of awakening that happen in human life. And classically, these 4 stages are what, this is the classic basis of the Indian caste system. Now, the Indian caste system nowadays is being intensely dismantled and is considered to be, and has been, an instrument of social oppression, and therefore is something that cannot go forward into a higher age. But the original basis, and we're talking in ancient times, the ancient origin of the Indian caste system was not about hereditary position within society and some people having power over others and some being superior to others. It was an objective appraisal of stages of awakening from delusion to God realization. So put aside any prejudicial ideas you have about the political or the social context, and let's just call these are 4 stages of personal development. And the 4 castes, the classic 4 castes, according to the ancient system: Shudra, Vaishya, Kshatriya, Brahmin. Shudra, and each one has an archetype, which gives you an immediate picture of the characteristics of that caste. And the archetype is not meant, again, you have to put aside all this political correctness and so on, and just think of it as storytelling. The archetype of the Shudra is the peasant person, the person without education, without opportunities, who works primarily through their physical body. So you think of a laborer in the fields. That's the idea of the Shudra. The Vaishya, the idea is the merchant in the marketplace, who is clever and uses their intellectual energy as well as their physical energy, but primarily their intellectual energy, to calculate their advantage and then to act to their own advantage. The kshatriya, the archetype, is the soldier, and also the benign, enlightened ruler, the enlightened king. The soldier is the clearest archetype. The soldier believes in an ideal, and that ideal would be perhaps defending their country, so completely that they're willing to undergo strict discipline, forego many of the conveniences and the comforts of life, and even to sacrifice their own life for the ideal that they believe in. The 4th caste is the Brahmin caste, which would be the priest caste. And the priest caste is completely dedicated to the will of God. Okay, now let's go through these a little bit in terms of what causes suffering, what brings happiness, and the other factor that's important here is what motivates that particular stage of development to put out energy and influence their own life. The Shudra feels that the greatest happiness comes from putting out the least amount of energy. And the Shudra seeks to comfort himself by dulling his consciousness. The Shudra will not work unless the motivation for work for the Shudra is the threat of punishment. If work, the greatest pleasure comes from not putting out energy. Work requires putting out energy, so the only way that I'm going to be motivated to put out energy is that if something worse is going to happen to me if I don't. So the Shudra is motivated by the threat of punishment. It finds pleasure and relief by dulling its consciousness with overeating, drinking, primarily just drinking. You know, the hard-working physical laborer goes out and does his labor, and he only works because if he doesn't, he won't get paid, or the taskmaster will hit him with a stick. And then as soon as his workday is done, he goes to the tavern, he drinks a few beers, he goes home. Maybe if he's a married man, there's sex involved. If it's television or whatever it is these days, the Shudra is, the Shudra is completely uncreative. The Shudra just does what he's told, and it never occurs to him to innovate or make things any better. Why would I put out any energy? What's the point of it? I just do what I'm told. If it's stupid, that's their problem. It's not my problem. Now, bear in mind, all of us have characteristics of these 4 stages. Nobody is purely one thing, but this is the full picture of what the Shudra level of development is. The Vaishya level of development is the Shudra works. He works with his physical body. He manufactures things. He assembles things on the assembly line. He digs holes for the construction guy. It gradually may dawn on the Shudra that somebody else has a better deal than he does. And so his cleverness begins to develop. And it begins to occur to him that he could make a better shovel. You know, here I am using the shovel to dig all this time, but I could make a better shovel. So the idea of putting out a little creative work to improve the condition of his life begins to dawn on him. And then he begins to think, if I made a better shovel, I could sell that shovel to my fellow laborers, and then I'd have more money. And if I had more money, I might not have to use that shovel. I could just sell that shovel. So it occurs to him that with the cleverness of his mind, he can improve his personal condition. But the motive, and so he begins to shift upward toward the Vaisha level. Now the Vaishya is willing to put out energy, and the Vaishya works primarily with his mind, not with his body. Not physical energy, but mental energy. Not necessarily intellectual energy in the sense of education or a profession, but with the cleverness of thought. But the Vaishya is motivated by a very simple thought. Well, the Shudra is motivated by how do I avoid punishment? How do I put out as little energy as possible? The Vaishya is motivated, how can I use my energy to improve my own condition to get more for myself? And I'm perfectly willing to put out energy. I don't have to have threat of punishment. The Shudra only acts if there's threat of punishment. The Vaishya is willing to act as long as there's something in it for me. And that's why the merchant becomes, here, I have a great product for you, but you've got to give me a good price, and I'm not going to give it to you unless you give me a really good price. And the relationship of the Shudra is always a trade. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. That's how it's going to work. The relationship of the Shudra is, what can I get for myself? What can I have for myself? The relationship of the Vaishya is, I'm happy to give as long as I get something back. And the Vaishyas can serve the world very well being merchants. They can be an honest, fair merchant. Some of them are not, but you can be an honest and fair merchant, but still you're always calculating your own advantage, and you never give unless you get. And you think it's stupid to give unless you get. But what happens to the Vaishya is he begins to sort of accumulate. He can become wealthy. He begins to know how to influence his own destiny with his own actions. And maybe somewhere along that way, he also starts being generous. For example, perhaps he has a family now, and he has children, or a spouse that he's very fond of. And he begins to notice that, gee, it feels really good just to give to my children. Look how happy it makes them. And when I see them happy, I feel happy. You know, maybe it isn't necessary always to get something back. Maybe just the giving makes me happier than getting for myself. Now, if we reflect upon our lives, we all realize that we We move from the Shudra, where we'll only do it if someone forces us to do it, to just sort of having fun, putting out energy because look at all how much I can improve my condition. And then we accidentally may discover the generosity is certainly as gratifying as getting for myself. And in some ways, generosity is even better. So from our own experience, and that experience is drawn to us because there's a rising and a refining of our energy. Now, the Vaisha also has figured out, and this is how the Vaishya consciousness works, that the way to avoid suffering, the Shudra avoids suffering by dulling its consciousness, by just by putting out as little energy as possible, and what little energy I do put out, I put it out in a really dull way. When you talk to a Shudra about ideals or principles, Shudra just doesn't care. Just doesn't matter. He just wants another beer and just to go to sleep. That's all he's thinking about. The Vaishya, though, has begun to notice that I can influence my own happiness by controlling the world around me. So the Vaishya's way of making itself safe, this is the word I'm looking for. How does the Vaishya find security in this world? The Shudra finds it by dulling his consciousness so he doesn't have to worry about anything. The Vaishya finds security in this world by controlling the world around him. Because he's become clever enough to realize that he can do that, the primary way he controls it by he gets security by getting money and making the world work the way he wants. And he also begins to realize he can exert energy. I can make my spouse behave a certain way. I can make my children behave a certain way. If I'm powerful enough, I can make the other merchants behave a certain way. The Vaishya level is also the level that wants to be politically active and make the world right. I'm going to make the world the way I want it. I'm uncomfortable because of this political policy. I'm going to use my money to buy the politicians who are going to make it my way. And as the Vaishya's consciousness begins to expand a little, he's uncomfortable because the people in Africa don't have enough to eat. So I'm going to make sure the people in Africa have enough to eat, because if I can control the world around me, then I will feel safe and happy. Now, that's a little confusing. It may sound a little confusing at first because you think, well, isn't it a good thing to feed the people in Africa? Yes, it's a good thing, especially for a Vaishya who's just beginning to understand that if he helps others, he'll be happier than if he only helps himself. But insofar as that desire to alleviate that suffering is based on his internal need to make the world a certain way, or else he's insecure in this world, then it isn't as elevated as it could be. And this is a very tricky part of this evolutionary cycle. Now, all this is about why are we in this world? What are we trying to do? So we start out as Shudras, or archetypally, we start out as Shudras. We rise to the level of Vaishyas. We start using our energy first for ourselves, and then we begin to learn a little bit that it's nice for others. But still, the fundamental motivation is that if I can make the world conform to what I think it ought to be, then I will be safe and happy. But what happens is, the Vaishya gradually finds out that the world has this extremely unpleasant way of not conforming to what I want. You know, maybe my children, I want my son to be a doctor, and I want my daughter to do this or to do that, and they don't cooperate. I'm just not able to make them behave in the way that I want them to behave. Or worse, an epidemic comes and 2 of my 4 children die, or my wife dies, or my wife has a mental breakdown, or my factory burns down, or there's a revolution and all of a sudden the laws of my country have changed. I mean, think about it. There's a hurricane. There's all these different things that can happen where no matter how much wealth and power I think I've developed, I cannot make myself secure and happy by forcing the external world to behave in the way I think it ought to behave. And as I was saying, this goes all the way into the political realm, into the serving the planet realm. And again, these are generous, some are generous and high motivated things, but they're based on a false assumption. And the false assumption is if I have enough money, enough power, enough will, enough determination, I will be able to make the world conform to my will. And as long as my happiness and security depends on that, time after time after time, both my happiness and security will be taken away from me. Not because we're being punished, not because there's an evil God up there and you did a wrong thing and now I'm going to smite you. Not because of that, but because the external world is not subject to the whims of the ego. Because the self that is trying to make it like this is the self that's identified with this, the jiva is identified with this limited form and with the ideas that this limited form has, and it is declaring that I know how the world ought to be. And it has a whole list of reasons, and they're very good reasons. Why should children in Africa be starving if I can keep them from starving? So it's not the generous impulse, the compassionate impulse that is mistaken, but it's the idea that I know how this world is supposed to be and I'm going to make it a certain way. And worse than that, that I won't be happy unless the world follows me. Now, if you're out there just selflessly feeding the poor and the hungry without the egoic need to make the world different for me to feel safe, that's a different level, because what happens is, from experience, we find out that this vaishya need is unsustainable. And it's very, very simple. We find out that it doesn't work. It sounded like a good idea as I was coming up from Ashuja and getting my vaishya skills in order and using them in a bigger and bigger way. It all sounded like a really good idea. But life experience over many incarnations, and this is where you have to have many incarnations, gradually shows me that this is a false idea. And it gradually begins to occur to us that the source of my security and the source of my happiness is not the world outside me, but how I react inside. And then that moves us gradually from being vaishyas into the level of kshatriyas. Now, the archetype for the kshatriya is the soldier who has an ideal where he's willing to sacrifice his life for his ideal. But the true kshatriya, the battle that the true kshatriya is fighting, is inside himself. And he realizes the real battlefield is the fields of Kurukshetra, which is what the Mahabharata, the field of battle in the Mahabharata with Krishna and Arjuna, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. That field of battle is symbolic because it's, and all of those characters are symbolic. It's all our own inner nature. We have the enemy we have to battle, the threat to our own happiness, is not really the world outside of us. It's how we react to that world. And then when our vaishya experience is sufficient to cause us to question our perception of the world around us, that's when we begin to introspect. What is really going on here? And you can't force this on people. If you talk to a vaishya about the need for inner awareness, the vaishya won't even know what you're talking about. But what teaches us, and I was talking about this yesterday, we learn from being disappointed, but we learn more from being fulfilled. We try it out. We get total control, we think. And time after time after time, we realize it's an illusion. Or we get everything lined up just the way we want, but our heart is still restless. So we begin to ask a deeper question. What is the nature of reality? Who am I? And we begin to come up with more subtle answers. We begin to notice that all I'm ever experiencing is my inner consciousness. And if I could get mastery over my inner consciousness, then I could really always be secure and happy. Because that is the one thing that no one, not even death, actually can take away from me. Everything else is subject to the whims of all the other jivas who are inhabiting the planet, who are acting out their own destinies, and the planet itself, and all of these things. So then we become kshatriyas. And we realize that our inner consciousness is the only battle worth fighting. And we begin to realize that our motivation in life is no longer what can I get for myself or how can I just dull my awareness. Our motivation is principle, dharma, that there are high principles that are more important to me than any other reality. And those start with ethics and honesty and generosity. But then they also gradually begin to advance in our understanding that I am a part of a greater reality. And when I live in harmony with that greater reality, that's where my happiness comes from. And when you're dealing with kshatriyas, you can talk about principle. When, activism was very, very, very strong, and we often go through this in stages, and people were beginning to rebel against pesticides and things like that, and you would say to a vaishya, you really shouldn't be manufacturing and selling those pesticides. And the vaishya would just say, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will do it. There's a lot of money to be made in it. Why should I leave all that money on the table for someone else? And you would say, well, it's not good for the bees. It's not good for the whatever. And they would just like, what is that to me? But when you say to the kshatriya, you need to close your factory because what you're manufacturing is very bad for the planet. The kshatriya temperament understands that's right. If I'm violating, if I'm behaving in a way that is contrary to the highest ideals that I can understand, I have to change my behavior. Because I will gain nothing and I will lose everything if that's what I follow. So most of us who are on the spiritual path are even though we have Shudra characteristics, we sort of teeter between Vaisha and kshatriya. We want to be spiritual, we want to do the right thing because we think there's something in it for us. This is good for me. I'll be admired, I'll be respected, I'll get certain things. Or we get into the kshatriya level where we're simply doing it because it's the right thing to do. And this is when we move into what Krishna called nishkam karma, action without desire for the fruits of the action. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. There's nothing in it for me in an external sense. And I also realize that it's hopeless to try to make this world perfect. God did not intend this world to be perfect. So I can put out all the energy I want to get it all in order. It's never going to get in order because there's always going to be Shudras and Vaishyas coming through this planet at this time. There's a whole nother system I'll talk about. But this planet at this time is filled with Shudra and Vaishyas too. And they all need to act out their Shudra Vaishya ways of doing things. And I am here to learn that world is not my world. My world is the inner world. Now, from kshatriya consciousness, I can still dedicate myself to feeding the children in Africa. But I'm doing it because, in principle, that's what I ought to do. Not because I need those children not to suffer because otherwise I am suffering. We are just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And of course we're doing it out of compassion. We're doing it out of love for them. But our security comes from the uplifted reality of our ideals, nishkam karma, not because I have to have this result in order for me to find happiness. Now, from the kshatriya level, what happens to us is that we gradually realize that where do these principles come from? Where do these high ideals come from? What inspires me to self-sacrifice? What really gives me joy? And we begin to understand the nature of that greater reality. And so from the kshatriya level, we begin to manifest the brahmin understanding. The brahmin understanding, the priest, is the ideal that there is only one reality, and that reality is God. And everything that happens is an expression of Sat-Chit-Ananda. And my security and my happiness comes only from my relationship to God. Okay? Now, next session, I'll take how all of these progressive stages of understanding result in how the jiva moves, incarnation by incarnation, into a greater and greater level of understanding until delusion is conquered and enlightenment has come.